today, this is an open session, which means that we can talk about whatever we want to talk about, but we're going to focus a little bit more intently on metrics. So our first pass at what we do today will be to share experiences and ideas around measuring meeting performance. So for those of you who are able to join us, last week we did ROI, and we talked about, how do you calculate the cost and value from meetings, and use that to tell a story if you want to make the business case. And today we're talking more broadly. What all can you measure? Why would you measure it? Sophie did a project specifically on that for the IAEA in Vienna. Sophie has a case study to share. Hi, Lee. Does anyone else, and I'm going to share some of what we captured for the New Rules for Work experiment. Does anyone else have a case study that they want to share about measuring meetings? Hi, Chris.
How's it going?
Oh, and here comes Steve. Excellent. Okay. Well, then on that front, hey, Steve.
Hello. How are you?
So I'm good. So, hey, in the chat, because we're talking about metrics, I would love to hear what draws you to this topic. What question is top of mind for you when it comes to measuring meeting performance?
Well, I will start.
Okay.
Yeah, what questions come to mind is our topics. One, it's necessary. You can't improve what you don't measure. You have to know what's going on, how effective it is. You have to get feedback from people who participate who otherwise might not. So you need some form of figuring out what's working, what isn't, and how you might go about improving it. So that's the first thing that it's absolutely necessary, in my view. If you want to improve meetings, if you want things to just go along the way they are, you don't have to measure anything.
Got it. Okay. So what gets measured gets managed. Yeah, dollars, turning it into money. Interesting, right?
In our case, sorry that I'm jumping in, but I didn't see whether you can raise your hand. But in our case, what we were interested in is especially the effectiveness of these different meeting formats. So the effectiveness of a virtual over a hybrid over an in-person meeting. So the purpose for us, why we wanted to measure that, was to also in the future be able to always choose the best option.
Mm-hmm. Right on. So when you analyze something, you can make better decisions about it.
Yeah.
Right. So in terms of things you can measure, meetings are enormously complex and they exist at multiple different levels, right? There's my experience of this meeting. There's your experience. There's our collective experience. There's our experience of this meeting in relationship to every meeting we go to that happens in the MIC, all of these things, right? And I started creating a ginormous spreadsheet of all the things you can measure. And then I was like, oh, that's dumb. I guess it will take forever to do it. So instead, I just wrote down categories. And I thought maybe we'd take a look at these categories really quickly, and then we can dive into Sophie's case study and see what she actually chose to measure, why she chose to measure it, and what they learned by doing that. I know, just except for across the organizational boundary, most of these different kinds of things that you can measure have some tool or tech somewhere that helps you automate that. Hundreds of tools for AI transcripts, for measuring talk time, for looking at eye gaze tracking, for sentiment, for cost, all of those things. There are tech tools that will measure it for you should you think that's an important thing to do. Hi, Stephen. Is there anything on that list that you have a question about or a thought about or something that strikes you worth mentioning before we dive into a case study?
I mean, one thing I'm wondering about is, I've been thinking a lot about like intangibles inside of different processes. And so like, I wonder if, I guess I could see two extremes, right? Like if part of my job is around team dynamics, I could think that maybe the most important metric is like, the idea of like churn inside the organization or people like leaving because of things. And I was actually in an organization where one particular meeting probably made someone quit, actually.
Yeah.
And so, like the other side though is like there's like vibes. So what would that vibe mean about there's like a good meeting that's humming along that people probably feel that, but I don't know again how much you're able to actually like turn that into this is a metric that means like good vibe in this meeting basically. So that's maybe the spectrum that I'm wondering about is those two things basically. So intangibles.
Lee.
I'm going to be that guy in the meeting that's like, I'm going to say the same thing that Chris just said and take up time. But I mean, that's kind of where my mind goes to, and it overlaps with the thing that I had posted recently about the net promoter score on there for like the golden question is like, is there one thing, like, would you return to this meeting or would you recommend this meeting or something like that, that may not tell us what's going right, but it gives us a sense of like, we're doing something as opposed to like, I hate this meeting. It's pointless and let's leave. So I would just say, I think a lot of times people do these really super complicated evaluation forms that are on a Likert scale. And it's like, how effective was the meeting? And it's like 3 out of 5. And like, I don't know how or why. What does that mean? So anyway, that's where my thought goes.
Yeah, on the intangibles front, there are scientific measures, around NT-ativity. It's a word I can't even say. Does anybody else say that better? NT-ativity. It's the quality of groupiness, whether you feel like you're really part of a group, psychological safety, satisfaction, energy, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, definitely. But the way that they're measured is either through like sentiment scraping from transcripts and from watching facial micro expressions, which is heavy science kind of stuff, or AI preposterousness, or in surveys. And there is always the act of asking that influences the question and the answer. So it's an interesting challenge for sure.
One other thing I just want to add too. So when I was working on the Portal device, we thought a lot about social presence. And so I think that might be another one of these scales, is that the hardware or the technology actually will allow for the suspension of disbelief that you're not in the same room if we're talking about remote meetings. And things like frame rates, syncing of audio and video, resolution, those are all things that kind of impact that as well. So I don't know if social presence is another thing to throw in here, is like if you have, so social presence is an outcome, but there's like a lot of things that are input metrics into that in some way.
Right. I think that what I've seen on that one is media richness as a metric, as a proxy for presenciness. Very cool. Sophie, are you ready to share? Oh, just in case, just one little quick note. Some of the things you were just talking about, turnover specifically and engagement. There are ways to tie meeting performance directly to those metrics and then use them to make business cases for shifts in behavior. And we talked about that last week. So if you're a contributor, all of that material is up in the contributors area. Okay.
I'm sorry, I actually have one more. I know this, sorry about that. One more thing. So is there something about the way that like power structures work inside of this? Because I think that like leader AMAs are something that I constantly hear from executives that are like, I would love to do an AMA. And it's like, of course you just want to stand up there and like be asked questions for an hour and give political answers, but does it really help everybody else in the audience or not? So I don't know if there's something about that as well that's another, I guess, maybe it's not a metric, but there's something about power differentials inside of meetings. So yeah, sorry, AMA has asked me anything.
For that one, it would be really cool to talk to Kelvin. So Kelvin is in this community and he's pretty active, but he's based in Australia, New Zealand, so he's not awake yet. Otherwise, he'd be here. And one of the things that he tracks in his software, he runs a company called Meeting Quality, and they use transcripts and surveys to then do predictive performance analysis. So they can tell you things like, based on what's going on in your meetings, that project is going to fail. That person is going to quit. This leader is poisonous, right? So, all right. Sophie, thank you so much for your patience. We're looking forward to hearing what you learned.
So I'm going to share my screen now. I prepared a little PowerPoint presentation just because I thought it's easier that way. Please tell me if you see it. I go on presenter mode, maybe. Yeah.
Looks great.
Yeah, okay, because I don't see you anymore, but I think for now that should be okay. Yes, so as Elise already mentioned, we did an evaluation of the agency's virtual and hybrid meetings and trainings. Maybe just for those of you who don't know, the IAEA is the International Atomic Energy Agency, and we are based in Vienna, or the headquarters is in Vienna. And we are an organization within the UN system. As part of our organization, we are actually conducting thousands of meetings and trainings each year. So they are very central, to our way of doing business. And I'm talking here about the rationale of why we wanted to evaluate. And what we realized is after this really strong push in during COVID pandemic, where actually there were no other options but to switch to virtually, virtual and hybrid events have become like an integral part of how we do business, but we never did an evaluation. We never weighed it, those different modalities against each other. So we thought it's a good time. It's a good timing because we have went from a very reactive mode to a mode where we can actually weigh different options. And the evaluation wanted to answer the question of under which conditions, these these different formalities are most effective and how they can best be used to enhance our interaction also with and between the participants. So what we focused on were scientific and technical meetings and trainings, because we have a variety of meetings. A lot of them are diplomatic meetings, policy making meetings, but we wanted to stay away from those because those are the ones that actually, as soon as it was possible, went back to being in person again. And what I also want to emphasize, we didn't focus on internal meetings. Of course, that's a whole different story. I mean, we would have 10,000 of internal meetings, but we focused really on those meetings and trainings or those events that were engaging with our external participants, with member states. So in terms of the data collection methods, and I think this is what you are probably most interested in, and that goes back to the topic of today's session. It's like, how do you measure, or what can you measure? We use a mix. In evaluation, you usually use a mix of methods, qualitative, some more quantitative. In our case, we were doing observations of virtual and hybrid events. And I will go into more detail on that. Then we were conducting an online survey with event participants. And here I have to emphasize this was all event participants over a given time. So not only virtual and hybrid, but also in person, because we wanted to have this comparison. We did interviews with people organizing meetings. We did literature review, and we analyzed meeting and training data. So those would be the data on like how many participants did we have, the gender of participants, the nationality of participants, because we also were interested, and I think that's also, I don't know if it was in the list Elise, but of course, one aspect of a meeting effectiveness can also be the inclusiveness and how open is that meeting to people from different backgrounds, etc. So we also try to look at that information. In terms of the observation protocol, and I think that's how I got to know your community, is because I was desperately trying to, find.
Oh no. Oh no. Oh. I'm sure she'll be back. Oh, there you are.
Desperately trying to find, and then it cuts off. Or I'm on the edge of my seat.
Yeah. So we actually spent quite some time on doing quite a fancy observation protocol, but we didn't end up using it systematically. And why? Because it was actually too sophisticated. And in the end, we relied on participating in a meeting and collecting quite basic information in terms of, let's say, for example, participants dropping out, observations on the, chats, functions, interactions between participants, on tools that would be used to engage the audience. So it didn't turn out to be that systematic data collection, and I'm just having here a screenshot, of what we in the beginning had, and that was actually, and that's just the first page, that was a observation protocol with several aspects, starting from the design of the
Sophie?
meeting to the, yeah.
We can't see your screen anymore. You flicked out, so we lost the screenshot.
Sorry, but you don't see anything like my presentation anymore?
Nope, we see you.
Okay. Then I don't know, something happened and I need to go back to share, no?
Yes, please.
Share screen. Okay. Share screen. Yeah, I don't know what happened here, but I will share it again.
Fabulous. Oh, look at that. So much more data.
So, yeah. So here we are. So you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. So that's just to give you an idea, So we really had a lot of different questions, aspects to look for in the observation. And you see here, occurrence, descriptive evidence, comments. In the end, I think there were two problems. One, our meetings are very basic. And the key issue, a concern that we found was that actually our colleagues are really not using virtual facilitation tools or anything. It's basically like the kind of meetings that they organized was doing a otherwise in-person meeting in a virtual format, but not paying specific attention to engagement. And in the end, I can also share with you that protocol. I think it was a very nice one, but it was not very practical. So the observations that gave us important data, but not to the level of detail that we initially envisaged. Our key, and here I'm coming to our key data was actually from an online survey that we conducted with participants, and we got around 2,500 responses, so quite a good amount. And it was a mix of open-ended questions and rating questions, like total 21. And we really covered things like the basic info on, what kind of meeting they attended, then an overall assessment, then like very practical things about how that event was organized. And I think that was the most valuable, what we used in the end most was the personal experience during that meeting and the value for the participants. And in the end, what we also, here, I know in this group, we are more focused on meetings. We also cover trainings, but we actually use the same questionnaires because we realized there's not so much of a difference. And I can show you now, and I can also share the survey design with you later, some sample questions, just so that you have an idea of what kind of aspects we were looking for. In this question, we wanted to, for example, find out, did the people only attend because it was in person? Did they only attend because it was virtually? So is it like an aspect also of convenience, and what's more accessible? Then, for example, we had a question on the overall assessment. I think this I stole from Elise, so I think you had I saw it somewhere in the meeting community platform. That was a little bit what I think someone mentioned before, no, in terms of a Likert scale or so, like what does it mean 3 out of 5? We tried to make something really simple. So we gave this option of saying, terrible, it was a waste of my time, pretty extreme, and then also, this was great, I want more meetings like this. I really liked it because it was very kind of approachable somehow. Then we had questions in terms of like how the meeting was actually run. Did it maintain a reasonable pace? Did they feel that the right people attended the meeting? So that was more about the organization of the meeting. And this was like very much at the core and the personal experience during the meeting. And I think especially for us, it was important because we really wanted to compare these experiences in a virtual, hybrid versus an in-person format. So here we wanted to say, was it possible for them to connect with others? Was it possible to really use their knowledge and skills to engage sufficiently, etc.? So that was one of the central questions, actually. And I mean, these are just some example questions. We also asked what would be their preference in general, just to get a little bit idea about what is the general preference, of the participants. And so those were actually the key, that was one of the key data collection instruments that we had, and that was very, very useful. Of course, there was also data on, for example, engagement. I mean, our colleagues had started collecting data on how long people stay in a meeting. And this was actually quite sobering because what they found was that a lot of people drop out very early on when they are attending virtually. So we also complemented, our analysis with this data. And in the end, what we found was that the agency, learned very fast because it was forced to, and everyone had to suddenly switch to virtual events. But we have kind of stagnated at a relatively basic level of conducting these events. And we realized there's a lot more needed in terms of facilitation skills and in terms of really truly making that meetings virtually effective. So we had a feeling it's not very mature yet. And that also showed in the perceptions and I'm going to switch now to into the perceptions of the meeting participants. So in general, it was very positive, but it was still much more positive for the in-person participants who rated this overly much higher. And also in terms of these aspects that I mentioned before, you see here virtual and in-person in some question, you see there were much more positive ratings for the in-person meetings, which for us was not a surprise because from what we observed, and that's why I think the observations were important. We were sitting through some of these meetings, they were awful. They were just a series of PowerPoint presentations and basically no interaction whatsoever. And so we were not surprised to see this. So our main conclusion was really, okay, there's still a long way to go. And then we can start about actually comparing like a really well-run virtual event to a really well-run in-person event, but we are not even there yet. And another thing that maybe before I stop, I don't know if I'm okay with time, Elise.
You're good.
Because another thing that I also wanted to say is like that was in terms of the effectiveness of what works, what doesn't, it really depends. And this is because we have such a big variety. I mean, there are some kind of meetings that are really for negotiation, let's say, on like drafting a radiation safety guidance. We had this interview with someone who said, it's very difficult to effectively do this in a virtual format because some people were basically going silent, and you need to reach a diplomatic consensus. And what happened was that he didn't feel comfortable because he kept having to encourage different countries to participate, and he was already feeling that it was already going beyond, our role of just convening. So he said in this context, and a lot of people confirmed that, they wouldn't do virtual events at all. But if it's more for information sharing, etc., then it's completely fine. So we managed to, what we got also as a result of this evaluation was to identify factors that lend themselves more for a virtual format vis-a-vis an in-person format. And that was a quite useful outcome, I think, for my organization. The big problem was the hybrid events, because they are the most common now, but the most difficult to implement. And in our case, what we found is that you need to say no sometimes, but actually, because it's sometimes political and member states say, I can't travel, I want to participate, literally every event turned into a hybrid event, which was more live streaming, let's say, of an in-person event. So it was not a truly hybrid event that was properly facilitated. So this was one of the biggest areas where we said this needs to improve. And then maybe another interesting result, I don't know in what context you all work, but in my context, there was a kind of performance indicator from our Director General who was saying that at least 25% should be virtual of all events. And this has been really not going down well in the organization, because it was, first of all, not clear what are we talking about. Is like, are hybrid events also part of that 25%? How do we measure it? And then it was also a bit perceived as patronizing, like leaving the authority, to decide on like what meeting works better virtually versus what better in person to the individuals who are organizing the event. So some people felt that they were, I don't know, like under pressure to do it in a certain way, and it was not always for the best outcome. So in the end, what our evaluation also was recommended was getting rid of that strict target, and adding more context and adding more guidance so that every individual can make the best decision for their event. So that was quite an important outcome as well. I'm going to stop here. I hope I gave you a little bit of an overview. Yes. So of course, like we didn't focus on one event only. I think sometimes you look for metrics to really evaluate the effectiveness maybe of one meeting or a series of meetings. We looked very much as a more organizational issue, as events, as part of our way of doing business and how we can do that better. And yeah, so it was a bit broader than probably what some of you would do. Yeah.
Thank you, Sophie. I know we have some questions, and I have my first question real quick for you is, will you be okay with us sharing your slides afterwards?
Yeah, sure.
Great. All right. Lee, did you want to ask your question? Because I think Sophie has a difficult time seeing the chat on her browser.
So shall I stop sharing the screen so that I can see what's going on? Is that okay?
That would be great.
Yeah?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. Stop sharing. Yeah. Okay.
Hi. Guten Abend.
Hello.
I actually think Robin has probably a similar question, but would you say, it sounds like the online meetings were mostly presentations, like there wasn't a lot of meeting perhaps happening. It was mostly people just being like spoken to, but then there's maybe more variety in the in-person meetings. Is that fair? I mean, like we're not just comparing PowerPoints in person to PowerPoints online, but online tended to just be PowerPoints. Is that right?
Yeah, I think, I mean, in the end, all meeting formats have also been done in the virtual sphere, so to say. That can be technical meeting, that can be consultancy meeting. So we have these different categories, and all of them had also happened in a virtual format. But some of them, we would say, have been stripped off that kind of extra benefits, which is like some informal engagements, some social events, you know, around these meetings, etc. So there was a lot of what we found intangible value that people emphasized, you know, when we talked with them about their experience during a meeting. And that was actually everything that happened outside of the official agenda. And that's very difficult to measure, but in our context, actually very important. And that's also because it can be even examples like someone said, some of the people are very shy and they would only be able to ask another expert about a specific questions when they were having a coffee or when they were not in the spotlight, etc. So you have aspects like this. But in general, actually, all our meetings, different formats were done both virtually and in person. Some of them per se are more interactive and more engaging, and some of them are really a series of PowerPoint presentations. But that happened in in-person meetings as well. Yeah. Sorry if I'm yeah.
No, and then just a quick follow-up then. So would you say if I did the same format online versus in person at the agency there, the in-person would outperform the online, mostly because of some of these like intangible, maybe not intangible, but these like sort of fringe benefits of like, I got to lean over to Elise and whisper something or shake her hand or something like that.
Yeah. And I mean, what you should also not forget, we are dealing with member states, like coming from all, like usually their participation is paid. We are in Vienna. I mean, it's a nice trip, you know, you can do, there's a lot of side benefits. And I think this is maybe, yeah, like controversial to say, but of course this also helps. Whereas when you have what we found, when you have a virtual event, the pressure is on that event. You better get it really, really right because you don't have anything to distract. You don't have, I don't know, a nice like restaurant in the evening, like a paid travel to Vienna. So it's really like we felt that actually demand on the meeting as such, on a basic event, is even higher. So there's a lot of pressure to really deliver a great meeting in that way.
That's
Yeah.
that's such a huge and useful observation, right? If you meet online, you have to get it right. The pressure is on.
Yeah. Yeah.
I hadn't really appreciated how off the hook we used to be for running lousy events because there were biscuits.
Yeah. So, and that, I mean, that really showed in the results of the survey and in the conversations that we had. And there's also, I mean, we are in diplomatic circles. Travel is prestige also, and there is a certain prestige coming with going to somewhere, to a meeting, being invited. Whereas some of our colleagues said, you can easily send a link and ask them to join virtually, but there's not the same kind of esteem or recognition coming than actually saying, come here. So it's a different, it starts with a different attitude somehow. Yeah.
Do we have other questions for Sophie? Thank you so much. Yeah, Stephen.
Steve Buckley. Yeah, it's interesting that Sophie mentioned the push to do more hybrid meetings, and I'm wondering what's behind that, because I don't know if anybody who said, geez, this would have been so much better if it was hybrid. So it might be I'm guessing that a lot of it might be a wish to go back to the old days,
Yeah.
where it was mostly in-person meetings and smaller and more elitist, more of the, now more people from anywhere can join, and now it's harder to run. So I wonder if it's reactionary to let's go back to the old days when, it was much easier to run a meeting. And that, and particularly another factor may be, I'm just throwing this out for thought, that if the hybrid meetings are kind of a streaming experience for the remote people, then I can see them responding to a survey and saying, well, if I'm just going to be watching an in-person meeting remotely, then I guess, yes, okay, fine. I'd rather go to a in-person meeting. So I wonder. So I'm just throwing out some thoughts there about how the people's the pushback, I guess, to this new way it might be recognized in the data somehow. Go ahead.
Yeah. In our case, most of the hybrid events happened because actually it was a in-person event planned. And then it was a plan B to engage certain people who were not able to travel. So it started actually with us having gone back to the old way of doing things very much, but still having new expectations in terms of our external participants and member states to always be also able to access online because you got used to it. And what we also argued, it's okay sometimes that it's a live streaming of an online event, but it should be specific. And maybe we need more subcategories of hybrid events to manage expectations and to be able to send a signal, is this just me? I'm able to stream in a little bit and watch, or am I going to be able to actively participate? So this is also something that we recommended, to be a little bit more nuanced about it.
Okay.
Thank you.
So as she was talking, I have 2 case studies I can share. Does anybody have a final question for Sophie or something else they'd like to highlight in their own work before we dive into that? Okay. And then if somebody wants to finish up the icons for this, Dave and I in the labs posited that we should have a scale for engagement that we could put on events before people came so that they wouldn't be disappointed if it was just presentations. We were looking for some cool icons, and we're like, come engage, because when you say it's an engaging event, does that mean it's going to be intellectually stimulating? Or does it mean you actually get to do something? Very, very different versions of engagement. But speaking of engagement and virtual events and whatnot, and the New Rules for Work experiment, we did collect a lot of data. We were looking specifically at, is there a difference in the results between in-person meetings and online meetings and hybrid meetings if they are all well-structured and well-facilitated? This is the code book that we used. I'll share my screen so you can just sort of see it in terms of data collection. The orange questions are questions that we chose not to ask because they were dumb, in my opinion. But this was something that was put together in collaboration with the meeting science community and other academic folk. So you will see things in here like entiativity and other words like that. Mostly, so all of this data was survey data, and it includes data about how they experience the meeting, but it also includes the things that you were talking about, Sophie, around gender and race and longevity, positional authority, psychological safety, how you operate in networks and whatnot. All kinds of data in here. I'm going to switch and show you what we learned at a high level. And if you made it to the event in January, this will not be a surprise. So at a high level, we ended up running 26 full workshops over the course of the experiment. More virtual than face-to-face, and very few hybrid. So one of the things I can tell you right off the bat is it's really hard to get people to actually show up face to face. So regardless of which one they like better, if they don't come, that makes it very difficult to get a good result. And I think that is exactly what Sophie's talking about with her hybrid meetings, right? Like, yeah, you want a face-to-face experience, but if they're not there, you can't have it. So that was our overall one of those key learnings. That said, we had two key results we were after. We were after how there was a creative brainstorming problem and they came up with final proposals. We're like, do people get better actual work output results when they're in person versus online, or is it about the same? And what we learned is that it is about the same. The biggest difference in terms of the quality of what they created at the end, the creativity, the number of ideas, etc., was the amount of individual brainstorming time we gave them. So in one meeting, they had 3 minutes, and in the other, they had 5. The people with 5 minutes to individually brainstorm came up with way more ideas because they would do their ideas, there'd be that little pause, and then they'd think of some more. So that was the biggest difference, was the not amount of time in the process. It did not make a huge difference based on where they were. In person for the 5 minutes, they did slightly more, which we attribute to the being able to hear each other, right, on the sticky notes. They're like, oh, I guess we're still writing. But that was really about it. Importantly, all of those survey questions, the answers were basically the same. People in person reported enjoying their meetings a little bit more. They enjoying the space and feeling like they could participate. They rated that higher in person, a little bit, but not a lot. And given that we couldn't get them to show up in person, and when we were in person, we often went out for beer, you would expect that rating to be a lot higher than it was, but it wasn't. It wasn't that big a difference. So, and then there's a whole bunch of data here about what they said, and what they said was really kind of across the board. Some people really liked it, some people really hated it. So we thought, okay, if maybe we're going to see big differences in our outcomes based on, age ranges or people's familiarity with each other, or their comfort level with the tech, or their comfort level with the space, or in terms of what they created and what they presented at the end, none of that really seemed to make a difference, which was fascinating. In terms of the business outcome, the thing that seemed to make the biggest difference was framing, which is, of course, why we've been all nutso about framing for the last several months. So that's what I learned with that one. What questions do you have for me about that experiment?
I have a question. It's great work, by the way, and I know how much energy you put into that, so it's nice to see it. So when you set out on this, it was, maybe I'm oversimplifying this, but to sort of disprove that hybrid or that online was bad and you couldn't be creative. I think you proved that, but you didn't prove that it's more creative. It's like equally, it's more about how you do it as opposed to where you do it. Is that an oversimplification?
Yeah, so the inspiration for that particular piece of work was a study that came out in Nature, that was then picked up by the media to say Zoom kills creativity, and then used by companies to say, okay, that's it. We need to mandate people come back into the office because you can't do creative, innovative work online. And we looked at the methodology of the study and said, well, not if you do it that way. You can't. So what if we tried doing creativity online using like a a process that is more likely to give us creative outcomes. And when the process is clear, what we found is that you get the result. Yeah, you reliably get the result when, you know, the question's clear and the way to go about answering the question is clear. That said, that's hard. Like as Sophie was talking about, that's a pretty high bar. A lot of people are not great about facilitating and engaging at that level. And it was a heck of a lot of work to design processes that could be used by whoever happened to show up in our experiment reliably. So.
I'm wondering how much you could vary the content of these things in the next study, just because I wonder if there's a tighter, like, there's more of a telling, like, is this in line with what I'm interested in and what I need to do in my job, or, you know, what I expect as far as like the outcome. Maybe, yeah, that's the thing I'm wondering about is if I were to ask people about meetings that they were running, right? They'd probably give a higher score, whereas other people that are not running a meeting, like, or that are attending because they don't want to be there versus they want to be there because of the content. I don't know if that has like a bigger change than if you're saying that there was like not as much of a difference between these different modes.
So meeting research in general suggests that yeah, there's this effect called meeting leader blind spot.
Yeah.
So if you're in charge, you think it's great.
Yeah.
And if you know, if you're forced to be in charge, it's not, which actually brings me to another thing I can share. And I'm going to just zip through this really quick. So another piece of work that we have done at Lucid Meetings, we look at organizational culture in general, and how do you measure, how do you recognize when a company or organization is set up to run meetings well, and what impacts does that have? You know, what do they have in place, and what impacts does that have on their overall performance? And we have a survey we use with clients and have done a couple of times generically that captures information about that. And it's fascinating. So when I do it large scale, we ask the people questions about their experience at work, like what kind of organization do you work for? You know, healthcare, education, et cetera, et cetera. You know, all kinds of things about the organization. One finding, which was a real surprise, is that when we take this data and then we split it based on the answers by company, we find that people from companies that have low meeting performance maturity are more likely to get their industry wrong. like they answer the questions about who their company is and what they do incorrectly. So that was fascinating. But this survey asks them all kinds of questions about, like, what is their experience? You know, how often do you attend? What do you think about them? You know, how do you describe them? All of that kind of stuff. And then we ask for comments at the end. Using that methodology, can you see, you guys see my whole screen? No, let me try this. Try this, see if that comes out. So the colors here are not great, but if you are in a mature organization, you tend to say that your meetings are driven. That was the #1 answer. People with low meeting maturity called them challenging, frustrating more often, right? So the language people use changes. Sometimes engaging versus often is a big weight shift. And these guys on the mature ones, they go often and always is by far the larger part of the pie, versus sometimes and rarely on the meeting maturity levels. We sometimes get results. We often get results, right? They rarely do a bad meeting. They often do a bad meeting. So there are a number of things that you can see that are very, very distinct across organizations based on how much training and effort and clarity that organization has put into making their meetings effective. So I got a ton of data about that kind of stuff. There's all kinds of things you can measure. Do people measure them? Do they then act on those measures? Well, those are different questions. So if you're still here, what other questions or thoughts do you have? Because
I have a thought. I feel very sloppy compared to you now, because that is really that is of course like a different level of, analysis, and it's a much more, let's say, scientific approach to measuring effectiveness. So congratulations. I mean, it looks like a very useful and sophisticated kind of framework that you have developed.
oh my goodness. Well, I have been doing this for like 15 years and it is my job. So if it's, I would not at all compare. I think what you did was entirely exactly what you needed to do to learn what worked in your environment. And that's the key, right? Like you have to ask the questions that matter to what you're trying to learn.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm trying to learn how meetings work in the universe, which is a very different set of questions.
Yeah.
Other thoughts or questions?
I mean, I've been thinking a bit about like environmental design, and so I think the things you put in that maturity model around like culture and even just like facilities and things like that end up like how do you make generally bad decisions harder to do, and generally good decisions easier to do, and maybe even diving into like the idea of design fictions, like how do you make it physically harder to schedule a bad meeting?
Right.
That being something really interesting to me. So I don't know. I'd love to hear if you have any thoughts. It sounds like those are kind of the dimensions inside the maturity model that would address that. But yeah.
Yeah, ritual's a huge bit too, right? Like
Yeah.
there's environmental prompting and all kinds of stuff that way. That'd be really fun to play with.
I'll post a podcast that was with this guy Dart who does like stuff about work essentially, and so there was I'm going to get the terminology wrong, but it's basically a person that does retirement community or other types of like institutions that take care of people, and so people with like Alzheimer's, how he sets up the environment so that people can like feel like they're having to do things, and then it makes it hard to do the things like escape from the place essentially.
Right.
So I'll find that podcast. I thought it was really interesting because it talks, I think, a bit about like how do we set up good environments inside of our work, and so rituals, yeah, I totally agree, is another one of those. So I'll find it and post it. Just saying.
Very cool. Lee?
Two questions. One, I wonder like what lever you would throw based on this research, right? Like if you could only fix one thing or focus on one thing, knowing that like most organizations are not like, let's do the whole thing we should do. Like how do you show them that it can work? And then I also wonder, I know we've talked about this, what the impact is of like no one owning meetings, right? It's this thing that happens everywhere, but like there's no chief meetings officer. How that like everyone says it's a problem, but no one's doing the research that you're doing, right? Like they don't work. Too bad.
Yeah, so the lever, the first thing I would do is the foundations. It is always the first thing that I do. I go through and rename them. And if people could just rename their meetings with purposeful clarity and then run an escape hatch, Like make them optional, run an escape hatch. Like those two things have such huge ripple effects. And an escape hatch is a thing where if for anybody hasn't seen it, you show up and you say, hey, here's what we're doing today, and we promise to take some notes. So if you really don't have anything to contribute, you're welcome to go. In case you weren't sure what this was about or why you're here, or something's come up. We're going to take 3 seconds to break for coffee, and if you don't come back, we won't feel bad. You know, like that kind of a thing. Makes it so much easier to engage people in a meeting because they're there on purpose. They're like intrinsically interested more often, and they stay. And then I would say, okay, now let's do real work. But Lisa?
I love the escape hatch idea. Yesterday, this happened to me yesterday. I was in a meeting and I was panicking because I was like, I do not want to be in this meeting. I don't need to be in this meeting, but there was no escape hatch. So I just got out of the meeting, and it felt awkward because then I thought, oh, they think that, what are they going to think about me, right? But I didn't really need to be in that meeting, and it was online, obviously. So I like, in thinking of planning, of doing the escape hatch. And I also really like your point about making, if the process is clear, then you get the same engagement online as in person. And I've been going through thinking about many meetings that I've been through, and the questions have been asked, and then there's complete silence from the people that are online. And I'm wondering if distraction, like being, your dog is walking across your lap and those sorts of things that people are distracted at home, if that's something that's considered for lack or lower participation.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, I guess in our experiment, I can tell you what we saw. We just kept everybody really busy. So if kids and dogs and things came in, they did, but you were talking, or you were typing, or you were doing something. So there wasn't a whole lot of time to get distracted hard, which was actually one of the challenges. When you do research, you have to make everything really, really, really fast, so you don't get to go very deep. But if you don't make it fast, nobody will come. All right. Well, I'd be curious to hear if you found this useful. As always, we love feedback. And I want to triple thank Sophie again. I've been pinging her for months, going, oh, let's learn about it. And I'm so excited to have finally seen your case study. I'm so excited about what you learned. I think that was it's really interesting to see things in real situations. So thank you so much for bringing that.
Thanks a lot. I memean, I was benefiting a lot from this community, so I hope that I could provide something useful to you as well, because I was really actively getting a lot of resources and information from you. So thanks to you all.